Hi, Lewis.
Hi, Nancy. How are you
You're
doing?
fine, thanks.
Great.
Good
Well,
to see you
thank you.
again.
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Thank you so much for joining me. This is episode 3 of the ICO podcast. And just to preface this conversation before we get into the nitty gritty, um, Nancy and I met on Vancouver Island back in October. And we were so lucky, my girlfriend and I, to be a part of a pit cook that Nancy led. And Nancy is an incredible ethnobotanist, a expert in the First Nations. I hope I've got that right, First Nations, or has it changed?
No, that's
Okay, because
that's
okay, because when we were traveling in Canada, I heard some people saying First Peoples, so I wasn't quite sure. But
I,
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I just want to dive in, Nancy, and um, I really want to know about your background. The whole point of this podcast is to talk to interesting and unusual people with fantastic careers and people who are doing unusual things, and you certainly fit into that category. And ICO stands for Inspiration, Knowledge, and Opportunity. So I would love to know, what was your inspiration for doing what you do now?
oh my goodness. It goes back a long ways, probably to when I was very young. Before I was 5 years old, we lived in Montana, and I grew up, roaming around the hills in the Ponderosa pine woods and country around Missoula with my sister and spent a lot of time picking wild strawberries and Saskatoon berries. We called them sarvis berries and choke cherries and so forth. I grew to love plants and nature way back then, and haven't lost that love all these years.
Amazing, fantastic. And so what took you from, loving nature into the career field that you're in today? I mean, obviously, you went to university, but then how did things really get involved in the First Nations for you? What was that path?
Right. Well, we moved to Victoria when I was 5, and I always had an interest not just in the plants and animals and so forth, but how people use them. So I remember making a dandelion salad for my friends when I was in grade 4, and I did dyes with different kinds of plants and roots, and you know, just tried to figure out how they were used. Then, when I was in maybe 12 or 13, I heard about this field called ethnobotany. And I was lucky enough to get a hold of 2 books when I was still in high school, really, or to hear about them. One, The Ethnobotany of Western Washington by Erna Gunther, and one on the ethnobotany of the Thompson or Ntlakatmo First Nations of British Columbia. And that's when I realized this is a field that I could actually go into. I wanted to be a botanist of some sort, and this seemed to be just a perfect fit for me and my interests. I believe in our high school yearbook, it says right there, I want to be an ethnobotanist.
Oh, wow.
And when I got to university, um, I started taking botany, and then I took anthropology. And in my a third year course in anthropology, we had a speaker come into our class who was Chief Philip Paul. He was the chief of the Chartland Saanich First Nation, very close to Victoria. And he talked about things that I'd never heard of before about the residential schools and the issues around colonization and so forth that his people had endured. And I was really astonished by this because I hadn't heard very much about it. But anyway, when I went to do my honors thesis when I was in 4th year at university, I got up my courage and I phoned Chief Paul and asked him if there's anyone in his community who might be willing to work with me, to teach me about plants from their perspective. And I still remember him saying, "Oh, so you want to learn all our secrets, do you?" I said, "No, no, not your secrets, just anything." He laughed. He was teasing me, of course, and he put me in touch with his father, Christopher Paul, who was essentially, I call him my first teacher in ethnobotany, because after that, I would go out and visit Christopher every Tuesday afternoon for a few hours, bringing armloads of plants with me. And we would sit and talk about them and record their names. And we went out walking around his house and property. And we went up and looked at some of the sacred mountain, Llywelyn, near his house. And that's where I got my start, really. I worked with linguists a lot, even when I was first starting, so that we could record the names in the indigenous languages properly, because that's a very important part of this kind of knowledge.
Wow, that's amazing. Incredible. I mean, I was very lucky that I grew up in the countryside, and like you, I had a plant teacher, but mine was an old English guy called Fred, and he'd been brought up in a house that was surrounded by woodlands, and I'm sure nothing quite as exciting as your teacher, but that's where my passion came for the natural world, because he could eat everything that you could probably eat that's in the English countryside, and he knew how to pick it and prepare it, and he used to bring in soups and all kinds of things. So this has really fascinated me, and I think the more I got into studying permaculture a number of years ago, and then sort of really started to understand a little bit more about ethnobotany. I mean, it's such an incredible and fascinating thing, but it is quite sad that not so many people are knowledgeable about it, and I think it's such valuable knowledge that we need to preserve. And people like you are doing such amazing works, and I think thankfully that other ethnobotanists over the last, I guess, 20, 30 years seem to be getting a little bit more out there, people like Paul Stamets and others. So how do you see your role in that? I mean, it must be such an amazing thing to be protecting and be almost the guardian of this really sacred knowledge that's been passed down.
Oh, absolutely. I should just preface this by acknowledging that I had a teacher who was from England as well, Freeman King, his name was. He was an elderly man at the time, fought in the First World War, but he was the leader of the Victoria Junior Natural History Society that I was a member of, and he was always very encouraging of me. So we have that commonality in our past as well. And right from the start, as I started working with elders and learning from them and learning the medicines and where to go to get certain plants and all of that, I recognized that we were bonded by a mutual love of plants, that the elders I worked with were recognizing that not too many of the younger people in their families or communities were learning what they knew, because they all were busy with other things. They had their own issues. And so I think they entrusted me with that knowledge, with the understanding and the commitment, unspoken, but there nevertheless, that I would help to document that knowledge and to keep it living and to keep it passing it along. And that's what I've tried to do my entire life, is to think of those people who were my teachers. Most of them, all of the original ones have passed away now, but to think of what they had in mind when they spent their time and energy teaching me about these things, that they had a purpose, and that was to make sure their knowledge wasn't lost. And so that's what I really try to do every time, to pass it on in a good way, in the way that they intended.
Yeah, incredible. And I think, Jules and I have just not stopped talking about that pit cook that you so kindly shared with us in Canada. I mean, it was such an amazing experience, and to see a real living, functional piece of history being remade in such an amazing way, and you do such a better job of explaining it. But the watching that pit cook come together as an event, and I'm only guessing, but I'm sure that's one of the things I think we've lost in modern society. Sort of food and eating is, we do it on the go, and we eat at the train stations and bus stations and in the car, and so we've almost lost the ceremony of honouring our food and where it's come from, and the plants and animals that have kind of in effect given their lives for us to consume. So I'm really interested about that, and I'd love to know where you learn about the pit cooking techniques and who taught you that, but also what really fascinates me is this ceremonial aspect of food that I think we've lost in the modern world.
Yes, that's a huge topic, of course. For the First Nations that I've worked with, and from my readings as well, I believe that indigenous peoples as a whole, peoples who lived for a long period of time in one place and depended on the plants and animals and fungi of that place for their survival, they have a special relationship with the land and with those other species, and it's very reciprocal. It's not just take, but it's a very much caretaking role that people assume. And some of my indigenous colleagues have called it kincentricity, the notion that these plants and animals and even the rocks and the water are our kin, are our relatives, and they're very generous relatives. They provide for us, but we have a responsibility to them as well. And if we don't meet that responsibility, it will go badly for us in the long run. And so that's an idea that I think is value driven, and it's shared through teachings, through songs, and dances, through art, through stories, and that's how children learned about this from an early age. I think humanity as a whole needs to take on that attitude much more strongly if we're going to be able to maintain and sustain our environment for ourselves and for the other species that we share the planet with. That was one response, but I've forgotten the first part of your question now.
Just about the pit cook. Yeah.
Pit
so
cooking.
Yeah.
Okay. I've worked very closely over the years with a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Harriet Kuhnlein. And she and I, she's a nutritionist by her background, and has done work with indigenous food systems all around the world. But she started working in British Columbia, and we got to know each other around 1980 and have been collaborating ever since. And she wanted to do nutrient analysis of the traditional indigenous foods of British Columbia. And some of them were foods that were pit cooked, and she wanted to take samples of the raw food, but also of the cooked food, the food that was cooked in traditional ways, to see what changes there might be in the nutrients. So I was working at the time with a dear friend, John Thomas from the Dididat Nation. And John's mom, Ida Jones, knew about pit cooking, and she had done it as a young woman, gone out with the root diggers of her day, and she knew they used to harvest the roots, and the women would cook them collectively in a pit. They'd tie their roots in bundles with special knots so they could recognize their own roots, and then they used them not just for eating immediately, but for processing, drying, and storing for winter. In those days, that would have been in the early 1900s, and or the 1920s. So John and Ida and John and Harriet and I went to visit his mom out at the San Juan River at Chidat. And Ida explained about the pit cook to us, and then we, with her instructions, tried to do a pit cook on the beach at Port Renfrew. And I remember very well, we tried to follow her instructions, and I'll just quickly describe them because we used the same recipe when you came to the pit cook. And I've been using that recipe over many years now, because this would be back around in the mid 70s, the early 80s, I guess. And the women would harvest three main roots that they pit cooked in this way. The springbank clover, which is a native clover with long white rhizomes. The Pacific silverweed, which has long tap roots, and camas, which is a lily with edible bulbs, not to be confused with death camas, which is another lily with poisonous bulbs. And they cooked these in layers. So they would dig a pit and put a fire in the pit. And they had special dense igneous rock rounded by that they got in certain places. They put those rocks in the fire and heated them until they're red hot. Then they would get salal, which is a plant in the heather family with evergreen, fragrant evergreen leaves. And they put a big bundle of salal leaves over the hot rocks. And they'd put a post in the middle after the rocks had gotten hot, and they took the unburned wood out and so forth. And then put the salal, and then sword fern, another plant that's common in our forests, as a kind of a layer below the food. And then they would put layers of food on top, interspersed with sword fern. And the camas bulbs first, and then the silverweed, and then the clover. And then topped with more sword fern, and then more salal. Meanwhile, you take the post out and pour water through the channel that's left, and it goes down and hits the red hot rocks and creates billows of steam. And it's actually the steam that's going to cook the food, because you quickly cover the pit and cover it over with soil to keep the steam and the heat in the pit. And then you leave it. And for properly cooking camas, you have to leave it overnight at least.
Wow.
Because it requires that much cooking to convert the main carbohydrate, which is inulin, into fructose, which is a more digestible, sweeter sugar than inulin. And but over the years, I've used the same method to cook potatoes and the standard vegetables, and you can do it in a much quicker time. People use the same method for clams and even for salmon and other foods as well. So that's the kind of the basic recipe. When you uncover the food, it has this kind of a fragrant, smoky kind of flavor to it. I think it's sort of a combination of baking, smoking, and steaming, and it gives the food a very special flavor. Even things like potatoes, you can just eat them without any kind of dressing or anything. They're just very flavorful, right, just by themselves.
Yeah, that's
So,
one.
sorry.
No, that's one thing I really remember about the pit cook is that, you know, we took the sort of hessian off, and we took the layer off, and then the billowing steam came up from the ground, and all the food came out. And yeah, it had this amazing, unique flavour. As you said, it was like a cross between a kind of barbecue, a smoker. Yeah, just amazing. And the vegetables and the salmon just kind of fell apart in your hand. It was just so good. Yeah, incredible experience. So I'm interested because we're struggling to get some of your books in the UK, Nancy. I've tried a few different routes, and I'm gonna hopefully after this call I'm gonna chase you up, and I want to get all of your books together. But I've watched some of your videos and things online, so I'd just love to hear more about your research, because I think this is something that lots of people would be so interested in. Just some of the uses of plants that you describe in some of your videos for rope, for fishing, for medicinal uses. I mean, I'd love you just to share some examples as stories with us.
Sure. Okay. Well, in this part of the world, often fishing and hunting is given primacy over plant use for food, and people kind of forget that plants not only provide important sources of food, fruits and greens and root vegetables and seaweed and even the inner bark of trees and so forth, but they are also essential for procuring the other kinds of food that people use from the ocean and from the land. So the plants are important sources of materials for making baskets, for example, for fishing line, for implements of all kinds. And each kind of wood has its own properties. And so you have certain things like yew, our Pacific yew, which is similar to your English yew, was used for bows. And in fact, the name means bow plant in a number of the languages here, wedge plant and others, and fishing spear plant and others, and so forth. But yew wood was used for digging sticks, for digging out the camas bulbs and clams and so forth. And crabapple wood was sometimes used for that as well. So every kind of tree and shrub around here had its own particular applications in terms of materials. There's a shrub we have here called ocean spray, or ironwood, we call it. It has long shoots that are very strong wood, but they're long and straight. And people use them for making needles, for sewing mats, cattail leaves and tule together to make mats. And they also use it for arrows and sometimes for digging sticks and fish spears and skewers and that kind of thing. And other trees like western red cedar, very, very important here, has quite light, easily split wood that could be split off standing living trees in the form of planks that could be used for houses, for roofing and siding of houses. And of course, cedar was also the main material for making the dugout canoes that people here on the coast are so famous for. Some of them were big enough to hold 60 people.
Wow.
It's hard to when I'm teaching a class of 50 students and I say, look around you, imagine every one of you sitting in a canoe together. It's pretty hard to imagine.
That's insane.
And of course, cedar was not only the wood. And one more thing about the wood, they made these amazing bentwood boxes with cedar planks where they would curve at right angles. They would make grooves in 3 parts of the wood of a plank, and then steam it or soak it for a long time, and then you could actually bend the wood into a right angle. And so 3 right angles, and the 4th fits together and is sewn with root or pegs. And those make the 4 sides of a wooden box. You fit it with a base and then a lid, and you can use those. Well, I have one.
Oh my God! Wow, that's
This
incredible.
is cedar wood, bent wood box. You can see maybe the corner
Yeah.
that is sewn or stitched, and this corner is bent.
Oh, that's incredible. It almost looks like it's machine made. That's wow.
Well, this one was gifted to me by our dear friend, the late Clan Chief Adam Dick, Quaxistala, and he made it. And he probably used a few tools in his shop for this, but he's also made 3 canoes with his grandfather when he was a boy, and he's also made a lot of wooden items like that. But the containers, the cedar wood boxes are very important for food storage and for other purposes as well. You can cook in those too. You can put something in the bottom and put water and then red hot rocks and bring things to a boil and steam things in that box. So it's really amazing. And then cedar branches, cedar bark, cedar roots, they're all used in different ways for rope and for making baskets. And in a culture like you see here, everything comes in pieces, right? Berries and even fish, clams. You need containers to transport them from place to place, to process them, and to store them. And so plant materials like cedar bark and cedar wood and different kinds of materials used for baskets are really an important part of the food system. We don't think about that very much, but it's true that you really couldn't have all of the food that you need without those materials to make containers to store them in and so forth.
Wow. Yeah, I guess you don't think about that aspect. I mean, I guess the immediate one is, transporting water, but yeah, of course. I mean, to forage, and Jules and I have done a little bit of foraging of our own in the UK, and yeah, I mean, it does take an awful lot of time and energy to find it, and it always surprises me that. I mean, here in the UK, it's quite hard to make a meal out of forage food. So you can only imagine that obviously they would have had a lot more biodiversity back then, and the forests were much bigger. But still, I mean, it must have required an awful lot of effort to go out and collect all of these plants and go fishing and then bring it all together as a meal. So yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. Another thing that I came to realize over the years of working with these knowledgeable people was just how important the human element was in producing the food and promoting the food. And the people here are often called hunter-gatherers, but to me that doesn't adequately portray the care that they used and the different techniques that they were using to actually produce their food. It was different than the gardening that you see in Europe. I call it different than Mr. McGregor's garden style of gardening, where you have annual plants that you sow in rows and you harvest and you select this, you save the seed and then you grow it again the next year. For the plants that people use here, they're all perennials, and so it's more like an orchard kind of food production, where you prune your berry bushes, you burn over areas that to maintain an open prairie-like atmosphere for the camas to flourish, for example. And other things that you do, like put smaller fragments of roots or the littler bulbs back in the soil, or digging your camas bulbs at the time of the year when the camas has gone to seed. So while you're digging the bulbs, you're actually scattering more seed into the soil. Those kinds of things, when they all go together, it could be for clams, or it could be for berries, or it could be for root vegetables. But people were actually cultivating these species in a way that wasn't recognized by the European newcomers when they came to this area. They didn't understand what they were doing, and they didn't see, they thought that people here were living in a very primitive way compared with what Europeans were doing with their gardening and their ranching and so forth. It was the methods of First Nations here were much more subtle, but they were every bit as sophisticated, in my view, as the food production methods in Europe.
If not more.
Yeah, if not more, because they kept, in fact, I mentioned Adam Dick. He gave us a word in his language, which is Kwakwala, from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation on the central coast here, that means keeping it living. If you translate it in English, it means keeping it living. And it's sort of a philosophy and a technique that people used over and over again to maintain the habitats of plants and animals, and to actually maintain the plants themselves by just partial using them, by pruning them, and by other methods of maintaining them. So it is a very effective way of producing and enhancing your food, but not one that was well recognized. Sure.
I mean, I think it's fascinating because that is what we now call permaculture, right? I mean, all of these books that talk about the techniques of replenishing your soil and companion planting, and the fertilization and the biosphere and the microbiome of the soil and the mycorrhizal relationship, and we're sort of making this all so complicated now, but actually for them it was ever so simple of just work with nature and respect nature and don't take too much and understand the natural flow of things. One of my favorite books that I've ever read, I'm sure you probably have heard of it, if not read it, One Straw Revolution by Masanobu Fukuoka. So you would love it. And he's a Japanese farmer. You could call him a farmer, I guess, but really he was I would think of him more as a Zen teacher, and he embodied Zen teachings within his farming and his method, what he calls do nothing farming. And so it was about sitting back for 30, 40 years and figuring nature out and watching things very carefully and doing as little as he physically could to get the food production he needed. And it actually got to a point where his rice fields in Japan, he just left to grow wild, and he was actually having the same production as all of the other rice field farmers who were using all of these sort of complicated techniques of soaking and draining and planting and sowing and all of this stuff. And he was just sitting back and writing poems and thinking about the great questions of the universe. So yeah, I think that's a really beautiful notion, and it just shows you that obviously nothing's really new, and we're just discovering this knowledge again. It's coming back round again.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think permaculture is a very good parallel to what people have been doing here. And the whole notion, too, of experiential learning, careful monitoring and observation over not just one lifetime, but over generations, and passing on the knowledge and bringing children into it from an early age, so they get the training and understanding in a different way from a lot of kids today. That's a part of it as well.
Very true. Yeah, and I think, like you said, when you look at old structures of indigenous populations, and I watched an amazing documentary about the Pirahã Tribe. I don't know whether you've seen that, and it was primarily about their language, and they're a very, very isolated Brazilian tribe, and their language was so complex that it could be sung, whistled, clicked, hummed, and spoken. I think there was this amazing diversity of language, but the one thing that the cameramen noticed was that when they were walking around with the linguist who was there translating, that even the children knew every single name of every plant in their jungle. I mean, it's the Amazon. It's not, so they have, thousands upon thousands of different species, but they knew intimately the plants around them and also their uses.
Yeah, it reminds me of what I heard the other day. The Oxford English Dictionary has taken a number of names of plants and animals out of the dictionary because people aren't using them anymore. And it's tragic. Things like kingfisher. And imagine a language where those words aren't known. It seems inconceivable to me. And somebody there in England has written a book on those words. They've taken those words and they've written a whole book about them. So hopefully they'll come back into the language again. But it's true that in many places now, children know much more about cars, different kinds of cars, than they do about different kinds of birds or plants. It's very sad to me.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think that loss of relationship with the food, where it comes from, and that life cycle, and I think even nutrition, and I've had a real keen interest in nutrition for a number of years now, and the thing that I find really interesting is that it seems to be coming out in a lot of research now that the closer we get to our native foods, the healthier we get. I mean, it shouldn't be rocket science, but I just think it's so interesting that actually, I'd love to hear about your friend's nutritional research, because I have heard of some research that when they talk about modern, and it was a comparison, I'll try and find the study for the show notes, but it was a comparison on store-bought iceberg lettuce compared with wild lettuce. And it was something like there was 400% more nutrients in the wild lettuce than in iceberg lettuce.
That's so interesting. And of course, all around the world, the food systems are changing. We're eating much more of our food from away in packaged and processed forms that aren't necessarily as good for us. So Harriet Kuhnlein and her colleagues, she's worked with indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, including in Canada. We actually co-authored a book together, by the way, called Plant Foods of Canadian Indigenous Peoples, or something like that. That is actually available online. And her other 3 other books that Harriet has co-edited are also online, all through the FAO website. So Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. If you look up their website and you look up Kuhnlein, Kuhlein, you'll find her 3 books on indigenous people's food systems for health. And she talks about what's called the nutrition transition, which is happening worldwide, where there's been a huge shift in people's food systems, away from those locally sourced fresh food to much more processed food from distant places. And for all of us, it's not as healthy as it should be. And for indigenous peoples in particular, many of them are suffering at much higher rates uh, from diabetes and other diet-related diseases because of that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because this was, Weston A. Price's research as well, and there's many others that brought up this same point. But when the turn of the century was starting to happen and people were coming away from their indigenous diets, they got sick. And the ones that he managed to photograph, particularly their teeth, and he's got these amazing books full of photos of before and after, these indigenous diets and these natives looking strong and healthy, and they've got these big beautiful teeth and big jaws, and they're tall and heads full of hair, and then the after of the introduction of different diets and sugars and things like that, and suddenly the teeth are full of dental cavities, and they're missing teeth, or they've got dental caries or crowding in the mouth, and the jaws were smaller. And so I think it was a really interesting thing, and that's a very good way to put it, this nutritional transition. And I'm really interested, Nancy, because I think I remember rightly, but when we were in Canada, I asked you a question and you were very busy, so it was only a very quick question, but it was about indigenous diets, and I said, in Canada specifically, what was the composition of plant matter in the diet? And I think I remember you saying it was about 30%.
Yes, that's true. Maybe more, depending on what area we're talking about. A little bit less in the north and more in the south. But not only was it a very substantial percentage of the diet, but nutritionally, very, very important contributions of nutrients that you don't find in quantity in the animal foods as much. So the greens, for example, provide vitamin A and vitamin C and various minerals like iron and so forth. The berries, and then there's these compounds like flavonoids that are antioxidant that you find in the dark colored berries, are salal berries, which did you have a chance to taste the berries while you were there?
Yes, I did, because you put them in with the salmon. I remember you'd got, I think it was wild crab apples, and you had some
Yes.
other kind of berry as well. Yeah.
We had some cranberries, but also maybe some salal. They're very dark berries, and they're very rich in flavonoids, more so than blueberries, which are often given as an example. Um, and so these compounds are not just for calories, but also nutrients that we need for our health, for strong teeth and so forth, calcium and whatnot. The root vegetables, they all provide meaningful amounts of these different nutrients that we need. And Harriet's books have nutrient tables that give you the quantities that these different foods provide. And even in our book on indigenous food plants in Canada, we have tables at the back that show the importance of different nutrients and the amounts that they provide.
Amazing. Well, that's on my list to buy now. Yeah, I think it's interesting because 30% is an interesting number. I mean, it could be lower, could be higher, but that still means that they must have been eating, quite a lot of animal products as well as the plants. And I suppose this is something that's really interested me, that not only the plants that they were eating would look incredibly different nutritionally from the mass-produced fruits and vegetables in polytunnels fed with nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium and nothing else, and not even in soil, but also for the animals that they were consuming, that the animals would have been consuming these really high density nutrient rich plant foods, and so I suppose that for some of the nutrients that maybe we struggle to break down, the animals that they must have been consuming must have been, incredibly healthy as well.
Yeah, I would think so. Certainly, um, all the descriptions of the first Europeans who came here, talk about how incredibly bountiful the lands and waters were in terms of salmon and um, marine mammals, birds, game of all kinds. It was incredible, and those two have diminished a lot here and around the world. I guess you've seen the World Wildlife figures about how much of the biodiversity we've lost, especially some of the larger animals and birds and so forth. It's really sad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that two things that really interest me are the destruction of the soil, and particularly the mycorrhizal networks, I can't think of the term that's used, but it's the sort of web of the soil. This incredible fungal growth that runs through soil for thousands of miles sometimes, and also as well as the insects, because they have such a pivotal role to play in our ecosystems, and it's insect genocide, which is I don't think we're quite seeing the implications of that yet, but I'm sure we will.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I can tell you're a Paul Stamets fan.
Yes.
My
Paul Stamets. I think I've watched every single lecture he's ever given online, and could still watch more. I mean, an incredible guy, and I read The Hidden Life of Trees as well. Which is just the most incredible book, and makes you feel guilty for ever writing on a piece of paper. These incredibly intelligent beings, of want of a better word, and their relationship with each other and forests and how they all coexist. So yeah, quite incredible.
Yeah, it really is. Really is. I hope you come back here so that we can talk more.
Yes, that's definitely. That's certainly the plan. But I'm interested in as well the natives and medicinal use of plants, because I think that's something that's kind of creeping back and people are talking about it. And Paul Stamets has done amazing research on obviously the medicinal use of mushrooms, and I was just shocked going into. I was so lucky to go into some forests in Shuswap. And in British Columbia, and did some mushroom foraging, and I was just stunned by the growth of mushrooms, and everywhere you looked there was some kind of mushroom or fungus sprouting. So the native peoples of Canada must have had such a relationship with those funguses and mushrooms.
Well, they did. In fact, the big tree fungus, the bracket fungus, has a really special role in some of the cultures here on the coast. In the Stamets Sanchatan language, it's called Tuto Alakap, which means echo maker. And the tradition is that the tree fungus is what sends echoes back. And it's not just for sound, but if there's any kind of a bad feeling directed to someone, if you have the tree fungus as a protector, it will reflect that bad feeling back on the person who sent it. And so it protects it. People will often, even today, put a tree fungus by their front door, by the house. And in fact, we have one by our front door in Victoria, as a kind of symbolic protection of the household. And Adam made a beautiful big one that he gifted to us with a painting of a wolf on it. And so that's just one kind of very special I guess, relationship that people have with that fungus. But there's also various fungi that are used medicinally, and one of them is the same as chaga, Ainonotus obliquus. It's the birch conch, cinder conch fungus that people used for not just for as a fire holder in a slow match. If you light it, it will smolder, and you can enclose it between the freshwater mussel shells and carry it with you or bury it in the ground, and it will hold fire for a long time. But they also use it for moxibustion. It's very similar to, I guess, what the Chinese healers use, where you put a little bit on your skin in a place where you have pain and burn it down, and it pops, and the pain is drawn out, they say, from that. So there are many different relationships that people have. On the coast, they didn't eat mushrooms traditionally, as far as I can tell, with maybe a few exceptions. But in the interior, they use through maybe half a dozen different kinds. One being the cottonwood mushroom, Trichiloma populinum, and one being the pine mushroom, Trichiloma magnivelare, and a couple of others. One of which it's hard to identify these because they're so ephemeral. You have to be there at the right time, at the right place, with the right person who knows to be able to identify them. But there was one mushroom that I heard about from elders called Hlitka, which means slimy top. And finally, I went out with an elder who knew what it was, Edith O'Donoghue from Lillooet. And we went out in the fall and we found it. And no, we didn't find it, but she had a jar that she jarred of it. And they do can the mushrooms like that. I sent it away to my friend Scott Redhead, and he identified it. It was, I was going to say Ainonotus, Hygrophorus gliocyclus, which is a mushroom that hadn't been collected in British Columbia before.
Wow.
And here there are names for it in a couple of different interior Salish languages. And obviously was a mushroom that was very important, but Western mycologists hadn't caught up with that yet.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
One thing, and I hope I'm not taking into too much of your morning, Nancy. It's morning where you are. It's evening where I am. But one thing that I would love people to know, and before coming to Canada, I really had no idea of the density of native peoples, and I suppose it was my ignorance. At school we all hear about the Native American Indians, and you see them in the films, but I was really shocked to hear how many different tribes, if that's the right word to use, that there are, and so many different languages. So I'd love people to hear just a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, in Canada alone, there are about 50 different languages spoken.
Wow.
And some of those are related to each other in the same way that the Romance languages, Spanish and French and Italian, are related, but they're distinct languages. And so we have, in British Columbia, 30 of those languages are spoken, which is pretty phenomenal. It's one of the densest linguistically diverse areas in the world. And a number of those languages are in what they call the Salishan language family. So the peoples of southeastern Vancouver Island, where I am here, the Snuneymuxw, after which the city of Nanaimo is named, and the Cowichan, they are related, and they speak the same language as the people over in Vancouver, a good part of Vancouver, the Musqueam. They're all Hulkameetnam or Halkameelam people. That's one family different dialects of one family. Around Victoria, there's another language, the Strait Salish, which is related to Halkomelem or Halkometenum, but is different enough that it's a separate language. And then there's Squamish and Sishaf or Sechelt. Those are Coast Salish languages, Comox or Tla'amin. And up the coast, there's a little enclave of Salish in the middle of a different language family. That is the Balakula or Newhalt people speak a Salish language, which must have split off from the original parental Salish, Proto-Salish, they call it, a long time ago, because their language, you can recognize a few of the words, but it's quite distinctive. And then there's another language family, the Wakashan, and that's, I mentioned Kwakwala, the Kwakwakwa people's language, Heltsuk, Haisla, Owikino, and Nutanoth and Dididat and Makah in the Washington Olympic Peninsula are all related languages that are in one family. And then another family that's very broad and extends across northern Canada, especially the Athabascan languages. There's Tahltan, Sekani, Dakelh or Carrier, Chilcotin or Tsilcotin, and across Gwich'in and right across Chippewa and so forth. Those are related languages. And then you go down into the southwestern states, and Navajo and Apache are also Athabascan languages. So people, before Europeans ever arrived here, people were traveling quite broadly for various reasons. They say that the homeland of the Athabascans is in central Alaska and Yukon, and there was a major volcanic eruption some years ago, actually a series of them, and that might have triggered people to move out of that area and move southward and then kind of spread out. And so there's all this dynamics of people moving around the landscape and sharing vocabulary, sharing their languages. As languages, people moved, their languages became distinct and differentiated from each other. But if you look at the names for plants, for example, you can trace how those languages dispersed and what groups of people had contact with each other. For example, you see many Proto-Salish or Salish words borrowed into the Wakashan languages. And you see, like the Newhalt language, which is Salish, has quite a few names of Wakashan languages like Kwakwala or Heltsuk embodied within it. And you see words that are borrowed from language to language to language, like the name for highbush cranberry, stulus or stulus, comes from a Proto-Salish word. It means a clicking sound, and it's borrowed into the Wakashan languages, and then it seems to have been borrowed back into the Newhalt language, and then the Carrier or Dakelh people from the interior, there's a family up there called the Stillus family, and they're named from that highbush cranberry word that they must have somehow gotten from the Newhalt area because they used to travel back and forth there. So it's really interesting to see how these languages have evolved and have dispersed and have interacted with each other, and the knowledge and the knowledge sharing and adaptation that is reflected in the language, in the names for plants and so forth. It's all fascinating.
It's just incredible, really, that there is so much diversity within Canada, and I suppose that the whole of the Americas, going back would have been very similar. What a shame we don't have a time machine to go back and experience all that wonderful, cohesive societies. And I guess one of the last questions that I've got is, with such diversity, was there any commonality within spiritual practices?
Well, absolutely, there was. And I mentioned the kin-centric worldview, the kin-centric approach, where uh, plants and animals are considered to be human kin, that they have their own families, their own cultures, their own languages, and they're parallel to those of humans. And that concept is really a spiritual one that sees animals and plants as spiritual beings who give themselves to us humans. And so the practices of always, when you're harvesting something, of asking permission, of talking to the spirit of the plant or the animal that you hope to take from, and the ceremonies that are meant to celebrate those species are found very widely. For example, there's a first salmon ceremony all up and down the coast that pays tribute to the salmon for giving its lives to humans. And the first salmon that's caught in the year, the first sockeye, for example, everybody would stop fishing and they'd ceremonially carry the fish up to the elders, who would then cook the fish and then share it to everyone. And nobody would fish for 4 days, and then they would fish, but only take as much as they needed, never more. There are all kinds of stories about, if you transgress those rules, you will have really bad luck. And there are many examples of that, and those examples are spread throughout the different cultural traditions in different ways. So those are just one example. The potlatch is very widespread, and it also is a spiritual and ceremonial occasion. We think of it as a, I guess, an event where you give gifts away, but the giving of gifts is very much a ceremonial representation of exchange, of a sacred relationship with the land, and ways of teaching younger people and people in the community about our responsibilities to the land and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's very important. And I guess Robin Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass.
I don't know.
Oh, okay. My all-time favorite book by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a citizen Potawatomi, but also trained in Western botany. She teaches in New York, and you'll love her book. It starts with a story of how humans came on Earth, and she has a wonderful way of bringing together Western science and Western botany with her indigenous knowledge systems and traditions, and beautiful writing. You'll just love it if you can get a hold of it.
I'll make sure I do. Somehow, some way, I'll get hold of it for sure. Yeah.
Braiding Sweetgrass is a metaphor for bringing together this Western science knowledge and indigenous knowledge to make something really strong and beautiful.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it, very much a real passion of mine, because I think we can all learn so much from these cultures, and I think so many of us in modern life have lost the way a little bit sometimes when it comes to the world around us, and all these things help to remind us that we are part of a giant organism. as Rick Archer says from Back Gap. I don't know whether you know Buddha at the Gas Pump, but he's got some amazing interviews from sort of spiritual people talking about interesting things, and he calls us sense organs of the ultimate. This idea that we're just part of this big living organism, and we've, I think, seen ourselves for a very long time as this monarchical top of the food chain, whereas the indigenous cultures, it was the opposite. We were just a functioning part of a larger ecosystem. So I suppose that was that then the foundations of that spiritual understanding of the native peoples of Canada, the First Nations.
Yes. Yeah, one other book that if you haven't read, you would really enjoy. Actually, two. There are two. One is the sequel to the other by our friend Dr. Richard Atleo, who is a member of the Hausut Nation of New Channel. And his book, the first book is Tsawak. It's spelled Tsawalk. Tsawak means one. And Hishuk Ish Tsawak means everything is one in his language. And he writes about Tsawak, and then he writes how Tsawak, that New Channels concept, can be used in a way to address the world's problems. And he's working on, he's written a third book, and he's working on a fourth book in this series on New Channels spirituality and how important it is in understanding the world and in looking after the world. He's a very dear friend of ours, and he would be very interested in the work that you're doing as well.
Amazing. That sounds incredible. And just one last question before we close. How has all of this impacted your life? In in the many years that you've been doing what you've been doing.
Oh my! I felt so fortunate to have had the opportunities that I've had, to have had the friendships that I've had, and the teachers that I've had, the family that I've had, and I often say it's been a life of endless fascination, because there's always so much to learn, and you can never stop learning. It just goes on, and the more you learn, the more rich everything becomes. So I just feel so lucky. I can't imagine any other life than what I've had.
Amazing. And if I could steal one piece of advice from you for somebody out there who's thinking about studying ethnobotany or who's got an interest in it, what would you say to them, and how could they actually go about making that a part of their life?
I guess I could turn it back and say, never be afraid to ask advice. Because, you often wonder, what should I do, or how should I go about something? And you're kind of, a lot of people are reluctant to ask the people who really know. And I'm thinking in terms of my work with Indigenous elders, and often they're very happy to work with you and to give advice and tell you, what they think is the right thing, and yet many people will hesitate to ask because they don't want to intrude or something like that. So I think go with what makes you happy. Go with the things, and don't worry about money too much. We all need money a little bit, but it's not the primary thing that makes you rich in the world. There's so many other things that are so much more enriching than money. And as long as you have enough to eat, just keep going and following your passion and enjoy life. And don't take up something that you don't enjoy, because you only have one life, and you don't want to waste it. And even if you make lots of money at doing it, if you're not enjoying it, it's not worth doing.
Yeah,
I guess that's if a trade advice, but it's good to just reflect back. Is this making me happy? Am I enjoying this? Do I want to do this? Do I think it's important? And you'll know the answer.
yeah, powerful. Thank you, Nancy. That's amazing. And I guess by studying ethnobotany, you might be able to find the food that you need to eat in the forest anyway. So you don't, you need even less money to live.
That's right.
So finally, tell everyone where they can find your information, your books, any websites, anything that you want people to know, events, and anything like that. I'll put it all in the show notes. And I use a really nice little click system so people can go and hopefully buy your books as well.
Yeah, the only maybe the book that I would recommend the most is the 2-volume Ancient Pathways Ancestral Knowledge book, published by McGill Queen's Press. Douglas and McIntyre. Oh, The Earth's Blanket might be of interest as well, from Douglas and McIntyre. And museum handbooks from the Royal BC Museum. Some of those things are out of press, but people could also download for free the PDF of the food plants of indigenous peoples, Canadian indigenous peoples. I'm not sure if that's the right title, but that's on the FAO website. So, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. And any websites or anything like that people can find you on?
I've never tried to find it, so I don't know. I think they're out there, but I haven't looked.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll take a good look, and I'll put them all in the show notes for people to see. Nancy, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom with us all. I so appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the UK or Canada again soon.
Thank you so much, and I've really enjoyed talking with you, Lewis.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.